Before there were armies marching under his command, before maps were redrawn at his will, before Europe learned to speak his name with fear, there was only an island that refused to be quiet. On the rugged shores of Corsica, the wind did not carry peace. It carried memory of resistance, of struggle, of a people who had never fully accepted being ruled by anyone beyond their mountains. The land itself seemed to resist order. Jagged cliffs rose sharply from the sea, forests pressed into uneven terrain, and villages clung to hillsides as if ready to defend themselves at any moment. It was into this restless world, in 1769, that Napoleon Bonaparte was born. His birth came at a moment when Corsica itself had already begun to change. The island, once fiercely independent, had recently fallen under French control. The resistance had not vanished, but it had been forced into silence. The pride remained, the memory remained, but power had shifted. And power, more than anything else, would shape the life of the boy born into that transition. His family stood in a careful position within this new order. They were of minor nobility, respected enough to matter, but not powerful enough to define events. They understood what survival required: adaptation without surrender, ambition without recklessness. His father, navigating the new French system, made a choice that would define his son's future. He aligned, cautiously, with the very authority that had overtaken their homeland. It was not betrayal. It was calculation. And from that calculation came opportunity. Napoleon's early years were not marked by comfort. They were shaped by discipline, expectation, and an awareness that advancement would not come easily. In a place where identity was tied to land and loyalty, he was growing up in a household that looked beyond the island. From the beginning, he lived between worlds. At home, he absorbed the fierce pride of Corsican identity, the stories of resistance, the sense of belonging to something older and more defiant than any empire. But beyond that, he was being prepared for a future tied to France, a nation that did not see him as one of its own. This contradiction did not resolve itself. It settled into him. When he was sent to mainland France for education, that internal tension sharpened into something clearer. The journey itself was more than physical. It was a separation from language, from familiarity, from everything that had defined him up to that point. France was not Corsica. It was larger, more structured, more rigid in its hierarchies. And within those hierarchies, Napoleon found his place immediately. Not at the center, but at the edge. In the military academies where he was educated, discipline governed everything. Students were trained not simply to think, but to obey, to calculate, to function within a system that valued precision above personality. For many, it was a path to status. For Napoleon, it was something else. It was a system to be understood. He was not immediately accepted among his peers. His accent marked him, his background marked him. His manner, reserved and intense, separated him further. Where others formed connections, he withdrew into observation. Isolation in this environment did not weaken him. It sharpened him. He watched. He listened. He studied not only the lessons he was taught, but the structure that surrounded them. He learned how authority was presented, how it was enforced, how it moved through ranks and rules and expectations. And in that learning, something began to take shape. Not ambition in its final form, but awareness. He found certainty in subjects that others treated as routine. Mathematics, artillery theory, the logic of movement and force. These were not just academic disciplines to him. They were systems that could be mastered, systems that behaved predictably if understood correctly. Unlike people, unlike politics, unlike identity, the army in its structure offered something that his early life had not: clarity. And clarity gave him direction. Yet even as he adapted to this world, the distance between him and it never disappeared. He was present, but not fully integrated. He learned the language, but never lost the tone of where he came from. He followed the rules, but never entirely accepted them as natural. This distance became part of how he saw everything. He did not belong to the system. He examined it. And that difference would later become one of his greatest advantages. Beyond the walls of the academies, France itself was beginning to change in ways that no one fully controlled. The old structures of monarchy and privilege were under strain. Economic pressure, political dissatisfaction, and shifting ideas about power were slowly building toward something larger. But at this stage, those changes had not yet reached their breaking point. They existed as tension, as instability beneath the surface. Napoleon, still a student, was not yet part of that transformation. But he was being shaped within it. He was learning the language of a system that was beginning to weaken, even if it had not yet collapsed. And more importantly, he was learning how systems functioned, not as ideals, but as mechanisms. Mechanisms could be studied. Mechanisms could be predicted. And eventually, mechanisms could be controlled. As his education progressed, he moved steadily through the structure laid out before him. Advancement came not through charm or connection, but through competence. He proved capable, precise, reliable in the ways that mattered within a military framework. But beneath that outward progression, something deeper continued to develop. A sense that the world he was entering was not fixed, that the hierarchies around him were not permanent, that power, despite how it presented itself, was not beyond change. This was not yet a plan. It was not yet ambition fully formed. It was simply recognition. Recognition that systems, no matter how stable they appear, depend on conditions. And conditions change. By the time he approached the end of his education, Napoleon stood at the threshold of a world that was about to transform. He was trained, prepared, and positioned within a structure that still existed, but would not remain as it was for long. He did not yet know how far he would go. He did not yet know what role he would play. But he had already developed something that would shape everything that followed. Distance. Distance from identity. Distance from belonging. Distance from the system he was about to enter. And from that distance came clarity. Because to understand a system fully, one must stand just far enough outside it to see how it truly works. Napoleon had never fully been inside it. And that meant he would never be limited by it in the same way as those who were. As he prepared to leave the world of education behind and step into the reality of military life, France itself stood on the edge of something far larger than any one man. A transformation that would break old structures, redefine power, and create opportunities that did not exist before. Napoleon did not create that transformation, but he was about to enter it at exactly the moment when it would begin to need someone who understood how systems could be taken apart and rebuilt. And that moment was approaching faster than anyone yet realized. When Napoleon Bonaparte left the structure of military education behind, he did not step into a stable system waiting to receive him. He stepped into a country that was beginning to come apart. France, which had once appeared rigid in its hierarchy and certain in its authority, was no longer holding together in the same way. The monarchy still stood, the institutions still functioned, orders were still given. But beneath all of it, something fundamental had begun to shift. The structure he had been trained to serve was no longer secure. At first, this instability did not appear as open collapse. It showed itself in smaller fractures, economic pressure that strained everyday life, political disagreements that grew sharper, voices that had once been ignored now refusing to remain quiet. For a young officer entering service, these changes were not yet a revolution. They were uncertainty. Napoleon began his military career as a junior artillery officer, assigned to positions that demanded competence but offered little influence. It was not the kind of role that created immediate distinction. It required patience, discipline, and the ability to function within an established chain of command. But even in these early assignments, something was already different about him. He did not see his position as fixed. He saw it as temporary. Where others accepted their place within the system, Napoleon treated his role as a vantage point. He observed how decisions were made, how authority moved through ranks, how orders translated into action and sometimes into failure. The army, like the country it served, was not immune to the growing instability. Loyalty to the crown was no longer absolute. Officers found themselves navigating a changing political landscape where alignment could shift quickly and consequences were uncertain. Napoleon adapted, not by declaring allegiance loudly, but by understanding the direction in which power was moving. As tensions in France escalated, the revolution began not as a single event, but as a series of pressures that could no longer be contained. The old order, built on inherited authority and rigid hierarchy, was being challenged by forces that demanded change. For many within the military, this created confusion. For Napoleon, it created possibility. He was not tied to the old system in the same way as others. He had never fully belonged to it. The monarchy did not represent something personal to him. It was simply a structure, one that now showed signs of weakening. And weakened structures invite movement. In the early stages of the revolution, uncertainty dominated everything. Authority shifted, sometimes suddenly, sometimes unpredictably. Commands that once came from a single center now competed with new voices and new institutions trying to define themselves. The army reflected this instability. Discipline remained, but cohesion began to strain. Officers questioned orders. Soldiers responded to changing political realities. The line between military and political action became less clear. Napoleon moved through this environment with caution. He did not rush to define himself. He observed. He calculated. And when he acted, it was with purpose. His background, once a disadvantage, now gave him a certain flexibility. He was not deeply embedded in the aristocratic networks that were losing influence. He was not dependent on a system that was beginning to collapse. He was, in many ways, positioned perfectly for a world in transition. Yet opportunity in such a world does not arrive cleanly. It arrives through conflict. One of the defining moments of this early phase came as revolutionary tensions began to turn into open confrontation. France was no longer simply debating change, it was beginning to enforce it. Cities became centers of unrest. Authority was challenged directly. Violence, once controlled by the state, began to emerge from within it. For a young officer, this environment required more than technical skill. It required judgment. Napoleon's training in artillery gave him a specific advantage. He understood not just the use of force, but the calculation behind it. Positioning, timing, coordination, these were not abstract ideas to him. They were precise tools. And in a time when order was breaking down, precision became valuable. He began to take on roles that placed him closer to active conflict. These were not yet the moments that would define his reputation, but they were steps toward them. Each assignment exposed him to the reality of a system under strain. He saw how quickly authority could collapse when not supported. He saw how fear and uncertainty could disrupt even disciplined forces. And he saw how decisive action, applied at the right moment, could restore control, at least temporarily. These observations were not theoretical. They were shaping him. As the revolution intensified, the pace of change accelerated. Institutions that had existed for generations were dismantled or redefined. The monarchy itself faced direct challenge, and the idea of absolute authority began to lose its foundation. France was no longer the country it had been when Napoleon first arrived for his education. It was becoming something new, something unstable, something unpredictable. And within that unpredictability, the traditional barriers to advancement were weakening. Rank, once tied closely to birth and connection, became more fluid. Capability, especially in moments of crisis, began to matter more than lineage. For Napoleon, this shift was critical. It did not guarantee success, but it made success possible. He began to move more quickly through the ranks than would have been expected under the old system. His competence in artillery, his ability to think clearly under pressure, and his willingness to act when others hesitated set him apart. But more than any single skill, it was his understanding of structure that defined him. He did not simply react to events. He positioned himself within them. At the same time, the revolution was becoming more radical. What had begun as a demand for reform was turning into a complete restructuring of power. Old loyalties were replaced by new ideologies. The concept of the nation itself was being redefined. And with that came danger. Because in a system where power is being rebuilt, alignment is never neutral. Every decision carries risk. Napoleon navigated this carefully. He aligned himself with the direction of change, but not blindly. He supported the revolution where it created opportunity and structure, but he remained focused on practical outcomes rather than ideological purity. This made him effective, but it also made him different. He was not driven by the same motivations as many of those around him. Where others were consumed by political belief, he was focused on control, order, and the application of power. As France moved deeper into revolutionary turmoil, the need for individuals who could impose structure on chaos grew more urgent. Napoleon was beginning to fit that need. Not yet as a leader of great armies, not yet as a figure of national importance, but as someone who could operate within instability without being consumed by it. And that ability would soon place him in situations where opportunity and danger were indistinguishable. By the end of this phase, the transformation of France was no longer a possibility. It was reality. The old order had been broken. The new one had not yet fully formed. And in the space between those two states, individuals like Napoleon began to rise, not because the system supported them, but because the system no longer had the power to hold them back. He had entered the military as an outsider learning how structures worked. Now he was becoming something else, someone who could act within a world where those structures were being rewritten. And soon, he would be given the chance to do more than observe that change. He would be asked to shape it. Revolutions do not create opportunity evenly. They concentrate it, suddenly, violently, and often in places where no one is fully prepared to control it. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that moment did not arrive as a grand invitation. It came as a crisis. By the early 1790s, France was no longer simply unstable. It was in open conflict with itself and with the world beyond it. The revolution had reshaped authority inside the country, but it had also created enemies outside it. Monarchies across Europe watched with alarm as the old French system collapsed, fearing that its ideas might spread beyond its borders. War became inevitable. And war, in a time of internal transformation, does not behave like ordinary conflict. It magnifies weakness. It exposes disorganization. It punishes hesitation. France needed control, but it no longer had a stable structure through which to enforce it. The army, already strained by political division, now faced external threats that required coordination, discipline, and decisive leadership. Many experienced officers had either fled, been removed, or lost influence as the revolution advanced. The chain of command was thinner than it had been before. And into that thinning structure, younger officers began to move. Napoleon was among them. At this stage, he was not yet widely known. He had shown competence, reliability, and an ability to function under pressure, but he had not yet done anything that would define him beyond the circles in which he served. That was about to change. The opportunity came at Toulon, a city whose importance extended far beyond its walls. It was a major naval base, a gateway to the Mediterranean, and now a point of crisis. In 1793, Toulon rose against the revolutionary government and aligned itself with forces opposed to it. This was not just rebellion, it was a strategic threat. If the city remained out of control, it would provide a foothold for foreign powers to weaken France from within. The situation demanded immediate action. But action alone was not enough. It required coordination. It required strategy. It required someone who could see the structure of the problem, not just its surface. Napoleon arrived at Toulon as an artillery officer, not as a commander of armies, not as a central figure. He was one of many individuals sent to resolve a situation that had already begun to escalate beyond simple containment. At first, the response to the crisis followed familiar patterns. Forces were deployed, positions were taken. Attempts were made to apply pressure to the city and force it back under control. But these efforts lacked precision. They reacted to the situation rather than shaping it. Napoleon saw this immediately. To him, Toulon was not simply a city in rebellion. It was a system of positions, defenses, and vulnerabilities. It was a structure that could be analyzed, broken down, and controlled if approached correctly. Where others saw conflict, he saw geometry. He began to study the terrain, the placement of enemy forces, the relationship between land and sea, the points where pressure could be applied most effectively. He identified that control of certain key positions, particularly those overlooking the harbor, would determine the outcome of the entire operation. This was not obvious to everyone, but to him it was clear, because he was not thinking in terms of isolated actions. He was thinking in terms of systems. Napoleon proposed a plan that focused on capturing strategic heights that would allow French artillery to dominate the harbor. If those positions could be secured, enemy ships would be forced to withdraw, and the city's ability to resist would collapse. It was a simple idea in principle, but its execution required coordination, timing, and confidence. At this stage, Napoleon did not yet have full authority to enforce his vision. He had to convince others, superiors, commanders, individuals who were still operating within the fragmented command structure of the Revolutionary Army. And this was his first real test, not just of military understanding, but of influence. He argued his case with clarity, with precision, and with a level of certainty that stood out in an environment where uncertainty dominated. Gradually, his plan gained acceptance, not because of rank, but because it made sense. Once implemented, the effect was decisive. The targeted positions were taken. Artillery was placed exactly where it needed to be. And the balance of power shifted rapidly. Enemy forces, now under direct threat, could no longer maintain control of the harbor. Withdrawal became necessary. The strategic advantage that had once supported the rebellion disappeared. Toulon fell, and with it, something else changed. Napoleon was no longer just another officer navigating a collapsing system. He had demonstrated something different. The ability to impose structure on chaos. The ability to see what others did not. The ability to act decisively when hesitation was the norm. Recognition followed, not immediately in the form of absolute power, but in something equally important at this stage: attention. He was noticed. Promotions came faster. Responsibilities increased. Doors that had previously been closed began to open. But more than external recognition, Toulon marked an internal shift. Until this point, Napoleon had been learning, observing, positioning himself within a changing world. Now he had acted, and he had seen the result. This matters because there is a difference between understanding power and exercising it. Once that line is crossed, perception changes, confidence changes, ambition changes. After Toulon, Napoleon no longer saw himself as limited by the structure around him. He had tested it, and he had found that it could be moved. France, meanwhile, continued to move deeper into revolutionary intensity. The government shifted through phases of control and instability. Internal conflicts persisted. External wars expanded. The system remained fluid, and fluid systems reward those who can act within them. Napoleon's rise did not occur in isolation from this environment. It was made possible by it, but it was not inevitable. Many individuals existed within the same conditions. Few used them as effectively. As he moved forward from Toulon, he carried with him more than a promotion. He carried proof that decisive action, grounded in understanding, could reshape outcomes. Proof that rank was not the only path to influence. Proof that in a world where old structures had collapsed, new ones could be built by those who knew how. This was only the beginning. But beginnings matter most when they redefine what is possible. Before Toulon, Napoleon was a participant in history. After Toulon, he was something else. Someone who could shape it. And once that possibility becomes real, it does not disappear. It expands. Success does not arrive quietly in times of revolution. It spreads. It distorts expectations. And for Napoleon Bonaparte, the aftermath of Toulon was not a moment of rest. It was the beginning of visibility in a world that no longer knew how to stay stable. France, still deep within revolutionary transformation, was not a place where achievement settled into calm recognition. It was a place where achievement immediately became pressure. Every success created new expectations. Every rising figure became a potential instrument, a potential threat, or a potential solution, depending on how the political wind shifted. Napoleon had moved from obscurity into notice. And notice in such a world was never neutral. After the fall of Toulon, his name began to circulate beyond the narrow circles of artillery officers and local commanders. He was no longer just the officer who contributed to a successful operation. He was now associated with a result that had strategic importance for the revolutionary state. But recognition in a fragile system is not the same as security. It is exposure. Within the revolutionary government, power was no longer stable or inherited. It was constantly being redefined through conflict, ideology, and survival. Factions rose and fell quickly. Alliances shifted without warning. Yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's liability. Napoleon entered this environment as someone newly visible, but not yet anchored. That made him useful. And usefulness in unstable systems is both opportunity and danger. He was moved into positions where his skills could be applied again, but always under structures that were themselves in flux. The military continued to operate, but it was no longer a unified institution in the traditional sense. It was a collection of forces trying to remain coherent while the political center shifted repeatedly. Orders changed. Leadership changed. Priorities changed. In this environment, adaptability mattered as much as competence. Napoleon adapted quickly. He did not attach himself strongly to any single political identity within the revolution's internal factions. Instead, he maintained a focus on structure, on outcomes, on control, on the practical movement of forces rather than ideological positioning. This made him difficult to categorize. And in revolutionary environments, individuals who cannot be easily categorized often become valuable. But value does not guarantee stability. At one point during this period, he found himself in proximity to political turbulence that went beyond military matters. The revolution was now entering phases where internal purges, shifting leadership, and ideological enforcement were becoming more intense. Associations mattered as much as actions. Napoleon observed this carefully. He understood something important. In systems undergoing rapid internal change, survival depends not only on capability, but on timing and distance. Too close to the wrong faction, and success could become dangerous. Too distant from the right moment, an opportunity could pass entirely. He maintained a careful position within this instability, not fully aligned with any extreme, not detached from the system itself, present but not absorbed. Meanwhile, the wars continued. France was still engaged with external enemies, and military pressure remained constant. Campaigns expanded across borders, demanding officers who could manage increasingly complex operations. The revolutionary state needed victories, not symbolic ones, but strategic ones that could stabilize its position. Napoleon continued to move within this expanding military environment, applying the same analytical approach that had defined his success at Toulon. He focused on positioning, timing, and efficiency of force. But something had changed since his first major success. He was no longer unknown. Now expectations followed him. Where before he had been judged by immediate contribution, he was now being judged by potential. Potential is a different kind of pressure. It demands confirmation. It demands repetition. It demands growth. And Napoleon was becoming aware that one success in a collapsing system is never enough to define a future. It only opens the door. What comes after determines everything. During this phase, France itself continued to evolve unpredictably. The revolutionary government shifted through different forms of control, attempting to stabilize a nation that was still redefining its own identity. Military necessity often dictated political decisions, and political decisions often reshaped military structure. The line between state survival and military action blurred further. Napoleon operated within this blur. He was not yet at the center of decision-making, but he was moving closer to it. His ability to deliver results made him increasingly difficult to ignore. Commanders began to recognize that his methods produced outcomes that aligned with strategic needs, even when they challenged conventional approaches. Still, he remained cautious. He did not rush toward prominence. He did not seek visibility beyond necessity. Instead, he continued to build something more subtle, reliability under instability. This is often overlooked in moments of rapid historical change. Those who rise quickly are not always those who declare themselves loudly. Sometimes they are those who remain effective when systems around them are not. And Napoleon was becoming exactly that. A figure who could operate inside uncertainty without being consumed by it. By the end of this stage, he was no longer simply the officer who had succeeded at Toulon. He was becoming part of a pattern that others began to notice. Where instability increased, his presence became more significant. Where confusion spread, his decisions became more decisive. Where systems struggled, he seemed to impose structure. And in a world where structure was disappearing, that ability carried increasing weight. Not yet power, but momentum. And momentum, once established, does not remain small for long. It moves, it expands, and it begins to define the path ahead, whether the individual intends it or not. Napoleon was now inside that movement, and the direction it would take him was no longer something he could fully control by caution alone. It was beginning to demand escalation. Revolutions have a strange way of selecting their survivors. Not through fairness, not through tradition, but through usefulness under pressure. For Napoleon Bonaparte, the years after Toulon were not a calm ascent. They were a tightening spiral of conflict, expectation, and accelerating responsibility inside a France that was still struggling to define itself. The revolutionary state had entered a phase where survival and governance had become inseparable from warfare. Internal stability depended on external victory, and external victory depended on leaders who could operate effectively in chaos. France no longer rewarded patience. It rewarded results. And in this environment, Napoleon's reputation began to grow not through declaration, but through repetition of effectiveness. Each time he was placed into a situation requiring precision under uncertainty, he delivered outcomes that others struggled to achieve. His methods were not always conventional, but they were consistently structured. Where others hesitated, he calculated. Where others dispersed effort, he concentrated it. But recognition inside a volatile system is never purely positive. As his name became more visible, it also became more scrutinized. In revolutionary France, visibility meant vulnerability. Every rising figure was evaluated not only for capability, but for loyalty, alignment, and political safety. The system that had elevated him was also the system that could dismantle him. Napoleon understood this balance instinctively. He did not present himself as a political actor. He presented himself as an instrument of necessity. At the same time, France itself was undergoing deeper internal transformation. The revolution had moved beyond its initial phase of reform and was now entering a period of intensified political enforcement. Power structures shifted rapidly. Institutions were redefined. Authority was centralized and then redistributed again under new forms. Within this instability, military operations became extensions of political survival. Armies were not just fighting external enemies. They were defending the existence of the revolutionary state itself. This gave military success a weight that extended beyond the battlefield. A victory was not just tactical. It was existential. Napoleon's growing involvement in military operations placed him closer to the center of this pressure. He was no longer simply executing localized strategies. He was now operating within campaigns that carried national consequence. And with that shift, his role changed. He began to be seen less as a capable officer and more as a figure who could be deployed where outcomes were uncertain. This was not yet command at the highest level, but it was trust at the most dangerous level. Because in unstable systems, being assigned responsibility is often more significant than being formally promoted. It means others are willing to depend on your judgment when failure is not acceptable. During this period, Napoleon's approach to warfare became more defined. He was not interested in spectacle or tradition for its own sake. He focused on efficiency of force, how to concentrate power at decisive points, how to exploit timing, how to break the opponent's structure rather than simply engage it. This approach reflected something deeper in his thinking. He did not view conflict as a series of isolated battles. He viewed it as a system of pressure points. And systems, once understood, can be influenced. As his reputation grew, so did the complexity of the environments he was placed in. Each new assignment carried higher stakes, broader consequences, and greater scrutiny. The revolutionary government needed results, but it also needed control over those who delivered them. This created a subtle tension. Napoleon was being elevated by necessity, but monitored by caution. He remained aware of this dynamic. He did not attempt to break free from it. Instead, he worked within it. He maintained a position that allowed him to be effective without becoming politically entangled beyond necessity. He understood that in times of instability, overreach is often more dangerous than inaction. Meanwhile, France continued to shift under the weight of ongoing conflict. External wars expanded. Internal pressures persisted. Leadership structures changed repeatedly as different factions gained and lost influence. In this environment, continuity was rare. But Napoleon was beginning to represent a form of continuity within disruption. Where systems changed around him, his function remained consistent, deliver results under uncertainty. This consistency began to define how others perceived him, not as a fixed political figure, but as a reliable force within instability. And reliability in revolutionary environments is a form of power that often grows quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. By the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer simply moving through the system. He was becoming part of its logic. He was not yet at the top, but he was no longer on the margins. He had entered the space where decisions were no longer just about following orders or executing plans. They were about shaping outcomes that would determine the direction of larger structures. And that shift meant something important was approaching. Because once a figure becomes essential to outcomes rather than operations, they begin to influence the system itself. And systems, under pressure, always move toward consolidation of control. Napoleon was now close enough to that center of consolidation that the next step would not simply be advancement. It would be transformation. Power rarely announces itself in advance. It builds quietly, through repetition, through results, through the slow accumulation of trust in moments where failure is not acceptable. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this phase began when usefulness stopped being occasional and became expected. France, still shaped by the instability of the revolution, had entered a stage where survival depended on continuous military pressure. The state no longer fought isolated battles, it fought overlapping conflicts across multiple fronts, each one tied to political survival inside the country. In this environment, commanders were not just leaders of armies. They were instruments of continuity. And Napoleon was becoming one of the most reliable among them. What separated him from many others was not simply skill, it was consistency under shifting conditions. While others adjusted slowly to changing political and military realities, he seemed to adapt immediately, as if instability itself was something he had already learned to operate within. This perception mattered, because in revolutionary systems, perception often becomes selection. At this stage, Napoleon began to receive assignments that carried greater weight, not always in scale, but in consequence. These were not symbolic postings. They were moments where outcomes directly influenced the stability of regions, supply lines, or strategic positions. He treated each one the same way, not as isolated events, but as interconnected systems of pressure. Every movement had consequences beyond its immediate location. Every delay created openings. Every concentration of force created imbalance elsewhere. Where many commanders saw battles, Napoleon saw structure. And where structure could be seen, it could be manipulated. His methods increasingly reflected this understanding. He avoided unnecessary dispersion of force. He concentrated effort where it could produce decisive shifts. He valued speed, clarity, and momentum over traditional forms of prolonged engagement. This approach did not always align with established military expectations. But it worked. And in a system under strain, effectiveness begins to outweigh conformity. As his reputation grew, so did the scale of responsibility placed upon him. Yet this did not translate into comfort or security. Instead, it placed him deeper into the instability of revolutionary governance, where success and suspicion often existed side by side. France was still not a stable political entity. Leadership shifted frequently. Authority was redefined repeatedly. Military success could elevate individuals, but it could also attract scrutiny if perceived as politically threatening. Napoleon remained aware of this tension. He did not attempt to resolve it through visibility or alignment with specific factions. Instead, he maintained a careful balance, high effectiveness, low unnecessary exposure. He allowed results to speak. But results in unstable systems also attract interpretation. By now, his name was no longer confined to military circles. It had begun to circulate more broadly within the structures of power in France. He was no longer simply an officer who performed well under pressure. He was becoming a figure associated with decisive outcomes. And in systems undergoing constant internal pressure, decisive figures become central reference points. Not always trusted, but always watched. At the same time, Napoleon's internal approach to command continued to evolve. He became increasingly focused on the idea that control is not achieved through presence everywhere, but through concentration at critical points. This principle began to define his operational thinking more deeply. Instead of reacting to entire battlefields, he identified key moments where intervention could alter the entire structure of conflict. Instead of distributing effort evenly, he concentrated force where it would have disproportionate impact. This way of thinking set him apart in a military culture still heavily influenced by more traditional forms of engagement. But the revolution had already begun to erode the effectiveness of older systems. And Napoleon's methods fit the new reality better than the old one. As he moved through this period, his relationship with authority remained complex. He was not independent, but neither was he fully constrained in the way earlier officers had been. His effectiveness gave him a degree of operational freedom that others did not have. However, this freedom was conditional. It existed only as long as results continued. In revolutionary France, there is no permanent position, only temporary trust. And trust must be constantly renewed. Napoleon understood this instinctively. He did not treat success as a destination. He treated it as maintenance. Each assignment became a test not only of ability, but of continued relevance. And he passed those tests repeatedly. By now, something important had shifted in how others perceived him. He was no longer just a promising officer or a successful tactician. He was becoming a figure associated with reliability in unstable conditions. This was a subtle but powerful transformation, because reliability in chaos is not simply skill. It is authority in formation. And authority, once recognized, begins to reshape the environment around it. Orders given to him carried different expectations. Decisions made by him carried broader consequences. Failures would be interpreted differently, not as isolated errors, but as indicators of systemic risk. But so far, he had not failed in a way that broke this perception. And as long as that remained true, his position would continue to strengthen. France itself remained in motion, still unstable, still redefining itself through conflict and reform. The revolution had not reached a final shape. It continued to evolve, and in doing so, continued to create space for figures capable of operating within its uncertainty. Napoleon was now firmly inside that space. Not at the top, not yet defining the system, but close enough that his actions no longer belonged only to him. They belonged to the larger structure that was beginning to depend on them. And once a system begins to depend on an individual, the relationship changes permanently. Because dependence always moves in one direction first. And then, eventually, it demands control in return. Reputation is not the same as power, but in unstable systems, the two begin to blur until even those inside cannot clearly tell where one ends and the other begins. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the stage where recognition stopped being an advantage and started becoming a burden. France, still reshaped by the ongoing revolution, had entered a phase where authority no longer rested in a single stable structure. It shifted constantly between institutions, committees, and emergency leadership systems created to keep the state functioning under pressure. In this environment, nothing remained fixed long enough to become fully secure. Even success was temporary. Napoleon had reached a point where his name was no longer unknown in military circles. It carried weight. It was associated with results. And in a system where results were urgently needed, that association made him increasingly valuable. But value in such a system is never safe. It attracts attention from multiple directions at once. Some saw him as a solution. Others saw him as a risk. And many saw both at the same time. He was no longer simply assigned to tasks. He was being positioned within expectations. And expectations are heavier than orders because they are less defined and more difficult to escape. During this phase, Napoleon began to operate in environments where the stakes were no longer limited to individual battles or local outcomes. His actions now had broader political and strategic implications, even when his role remained formally military. This shift changed how he had to think. Every decision carried layers of consequence beyond the immediate tactical result. A victory was no longer just a victory, it was a statement about capability, reliability, and potential. And potential, once recognized, begins to demand repetition. At the same time, the revolutionary state continued to evolve under pressure. Internal governance structures shifted repeatedly in response to external threats and internal instability. Leadership was not a fixed position, it was a rotating responsibility shaped by necessity. In such a system, individuals who consistently deliver outcomes become structurally important, even if they do not formally hold the highest authority. Napoleon was entering that category, not through appointment, but through accumulation. Each successful operation added to a growing sense that he could be relied upon in situations where uncertainty was highest. This reliability did not make him fully secure, but it made him increasingly difficult to replace. And difficulty of replacement is often the first step toward indispensability. Still, this was not a stable position. The same qualities that made him valuable also made him sensitive to political shifts he did not fully control. Revolutionary governments do not only elevate individuals, they also reassess them constantly. Trust had to be continuously earned, and it could be withdrawn quickly. Napoleon navigated this environment with careful discipline. He did not attach himself too strongly to any single faction within the revolutionary leadership. He focused instead on maintaining effectiveness in his assigned roles, allowing outcomes to define his standing more than alignment or rhetoric. This approach reduced certain risks, but it did not eliminate them. Because in unstable systems, neutrality is often interpreted rather than accepted. And interpretation depends on those who hold temporary authority. Militarily, his methods continued to evolve in refinement rather than direction. He became more focused on efficiency of force application, how to achieve maximum effect with minimal delay. He increasingly viewed operations as interconnected systems rather than isolated engagements. This way of thinking began to distinguish him more clearly from other officers. Not simply in skill, but in perception of structure. Where many saw conflict as sequence, he saw it as design. Where others reacted to movement, he anticipated its consequences. And where others focused on immediate outcomes, he increasingly focused on structural shifts that outlasted individual engagements. This difference was subtle at first, but it began to define how others interpreted his success. He was no longer just performing well. He was performing differently. And difference in unstable systems becomes a signal. As his reputation continued to grow, so did the weight of expectations surrounding him. Each assignment carried implicit assumptions that he would not only succeed, but succeed decisively. This expectation did not come with formal command changes immediately, but it influenced how he was used within the military system. He was increasingly deployed in situations where failure was not acceptable. This created a narrowing of acceptable outcomes. Success reinforced trust. Failure would have redefined everything. But so far, he continued to meet the demands placed upon him. And in doing so, he moved further into a category that few officers reached during the revolution, someone whose presence changed the structure of decision-making itself. France, still unstable, still shifting, still redefining its internal balance of power, was beginning to rely more heavily on figures who could stabilize local conditions through action rather than theory. Napoleon was becoming one of those figures, not because he claimed authority, but because authority was gradually being transferred to him through necessity. This transition was not yet complete, but it was underway. And once such a process begins, it rarely stops at its initial stage. Because systems under pressure do not distribute importance evenly. They concentrate it. And Napoleon was now moving closer to that point of concentration with each successful operation. What had begun as observation had become participation. What had become participation was now becoming influence. And influence, once established, does not remain passive. It begins to shape the system that produced it. War has a way of stripping systems down to what actually works. Everything else, rank, tradition, inherited prestige, starts to matter less when survival depends on speed, coordination, and decision under pressure. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the environment in which his rise stopped being gradual and began to accelerate. France, still unstable after years of revolutionary transformation, was now deeply engaged in external conflict. The revolution had not only changed the country internally, it had placed it in direct confrontation with other European powers that feared its spread and instability. What began as isolated wars had expanded into a broader, continuous state of military pressure. In this atmosphere, the army became more than a tool of the state. It became the state's survival mechanism. And survival mechanisms do not tolerate inefficiency. Napoleon's growing reputation for delivering results meant he was increasingly placed in positions where his decisions had immediate strategic importance. He was no longer just responding to orders within a localized context. He was now part of larger operational frameworks that influenced entire campaigns. This transition did not happen all at once. It unfolded through a series of assignments that gradually increased in complexity, scale, and consequence. Each success reinforced a perception that was becoming difficult to ignore. When Napoleon was involved, outcomes tended to shift in France's favor. That perception spread quietly at first, within military circles that directly observed his work. Then, it expanded outward into broader strategic discussions where his name began to be associated with effectiveness in uncertain conditions. But in revolutionary France, rising recognition always carries tension alongside opportunity. Because visibility does not only attract trust, it also attracts evaluation. At this stage, Napoleon was still not fully secure in any permanent command structure. His position remained dependent on continued performance rather than institutional guarantee. He was being used where needed most, which often meant being placed in situations where outcomes were unclear and pressure was highest. This was not comfort. It was exposure. Yet exposure was also what allowed his influence to expand. As he moved through these assignments, his approach to warfare continued to refine itself. He increasingly treated military operations not as separate engagements, but as interconnected systems of pressure and movement. He looked for points where small actions could create disproportionate effects across larger structures. This way of thinking began to distinguish him more clearly from many of his contemporaries. Where others focused on maintaining lines, he focused on breaking balance. Where others emphasized endurance, he emphasized disruption. And where others often responded to enemy movement, he sought to shape it. This shift in perspective was not always immediately understood by those around him. Some saw his methods as unusually aggressive. Others saw them as highly efficient, but even those who questioned his approach could not easily deny the outcomes it produced. And in wartime conditions, outcomes become the final argument. As France's military pressures continued to expand, the need for commanders capable of operating in fluid conditions became more urgent. Traditional structures of command, built for slower and more predictable forms of warfare, were increasingly strained by the demands of rapid, large-scale conflict. Napoleon's style fit this new reality more closely than many established approaches. He was not bound by the expectations of older military traditions. His rise had occurred during a period of systemic disruption, which meant he had developed within instability rather than adapting to it later. That difference mattered, because systems shaped by stability and systems shaped by disruption behave differently under pressure. And Napoleon had learned to function in the latter. As his responsibilities increased, so did the stakes attached to his decisions. He was no longer simply executing plans created elsewhere. He was increasingly shaping operational direction within the scope of his assignments. This created a subtle but important shift. He was moving from implementation toward influence. And influence within military systems during wartime is not static. It expands when successful and contracts when challenged. So every action carried dual weight, immediate tactical outcome and longer-term impact on how he would be perceived in future assignments. Napoleon managed this environment with increasing confidence, but also with awareness. He understood that in unstable political military systems, success must be continuous or it becomes reinterpreted. A single failure can reset perception faster than multiple successes can build it. Despite this pressure, his trajectory continued upward. France itself was still undergoing internal restructuring while simultaneously engaged in external warfare. This dual condition meant that military success had direct political implications. Victories did not only secure territory, they stabilized the revolutionary state itself. This connection between military outcome and political survival increased the importance of commanders who could deliver decisive results. Napoleon was becoming one of those commanders, not yet at the highest level of authority, but increasingly central to the system's ability to function under pressure. By the end of this phase, something important had shifted in how the structure around him operated. He was no longer simply one officer among many capable individuals. He was becoming a reference point, a figure around whom expectations were beginning to form. And once a system begins to organize expectations around an individual, that individual is no longer just part of the system. They begin to reshape it. And in a world still defined by instability, that transformation carried consequences far beyond any single battlefield. Because it meant the next stage would no longer be about proving capability. It would be about handling recognition that could no longer be reversed. There are moments in history when reputation stops being rumor and becomes undeniable reality. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that moment arrived not in France, but across the mountains, where war stopped being fragmented pressure and became a single, sweeping campaign that would define his name. France, still under the strain of revolutionary transformation, had entrusted him with command in a theater that was expected to be difficult, under-resourced, and politically secondary compared to other fronts. Many assumed it would be a test of endurance rather than brilliance. They were wrong. This campaign unfolded in Italy, a region that at the time was not unified as it is known today, but divided into multiple states, alliances, and shifting political entities. It was a landscape of competing powers, where military movement was constrained not just by geography, but by complex political arrangements. Napoleon entered this environment not as a cautious administrator of war, but as someone who immediately began to reshape its logic. From the beginning, his approach was different from what many expected of traditional commanders. He did not treat the campaign as a slow accumulation of territorial control. He treated it as a sequence of decisive pressures designed to destabilize the enemy system faster than it could recover. Speed mattered. Concentration mattered. Timing mattered most of all. Where opposing forces often relied on coordination between multiple Allied armies, Napoleon focused on preventing that coordination from stabilizing. He moved quickly between separated enemy formations, striking before they could fully unite, forcing them into reaction rather than planning. This created a pattern that would repeat throughout the campaign: fragmentation of enemy structure followed by rapid exploitation of the gaps created. But what made this campaign historically significant was not just its tactical success. It was the consistency with which it was achieved under varying conditions. Terrain changed. Opponents changed. Logistics shifted. Yet the outcome pattern remained remarkably stable. Victory after victory began to accumulate, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a continuous operational momentum. For the first time, Napoleon was not just succeeding in war. He was shaping the rhythm of it. As the campaign progressed, the speed of French advances created a psychological effect that extended beyond the battlefield. Opposing forces began to react not only to direct engagements, but to anticipation of where Napoleon would strike next. This anticipation itself became a form of pressure, forcing decisions that were increasingly defensive in nature. In warfare, once an opponent begins reacting to your expectations rather than your actions, the structure of control has already shifted. Napoleon understood this dynamic intuitively. He did not only aim to win battles, he aimed to determine the conditions under which battles would occur. At the same time, the political consequences of his success began to grow. Victories in Italy were not just military events. They were becoming symbols of the revolutionary state's strength at a time when internal stability still required external validation. This meant that each success carried dual significance: strategic and political. And with dual significance comes amplified attention. Within France, reports of his victories spread rapidly. What had once been a name known primarily within military circles was now becoming a subject of public awareness and political discussion. He was no longer simply an effective officer. He was becoming a figure associated with a new kind of military identity: fast, decisive, and structurally transformative. But recognition on this scale is never purely stabilizing. It creates expectations that expand faster than any individual can consciously manage. Napoleon found himself in a position where every action was now interpreted not only in terms of immediate outcome, but in relation to a growing narrative about his capability. Success was no longer enough to be noted, it was expected. An expectation changes the nature of pressure. Inside the campaign itself, he continued to operate with the same structural thinking that had defined his earlier successes. He focused on breaking enemy cohesion, isolating critical points, and applying force where it would produce systemic collapse rather than incremental gain. But now he was no longer operating as a rising officer proving capability. He was operating as a commander whose methods were already being watched, studied, and increasingly replicated in discussion. This shift marked an important transformation, because once a method becomes visible, it becomes part of the system it is operating within. And once it becomes part of the system, it begins to influence expectations for everyone else. The Italian campaign, therefore, became more than a series of victories. It became a demonstration of a new operational logic in war, one centered on speed, concentration, and structural disruption. And at the center of that demonstration stood Napoleon. Not yet emperor, not yet ruler, but no longer just a participant in history. He had become someone whose actions defined it. As the campaign neared its decisive phases, the implications of his success were no longer limited to military outcomes. They were beginning to reshape how power itself was perceived within the revolutionary state. Because when one individual repeatedly delivers results that alter the balance of entire regions, that individual stops being seen as just an officer. They begin to resemble a force within the system itself. And forces, once recognized, cannot remain merely operational. They begin to demand direction. Legends do not begin with crowns or declarations. They begin the moment people stop describing events and start describing the person behind them, as if the events depend on him. For Napoleon Bonaparte, the Italian campaign had already changed how he was seen in France, but what followed changed something deeper: how he was understood. Because success in Italy was no longer a collection of victories. It was becoming a pattern. And patterns are what systems use to define identity. The French state, still unstable and still reshaping itself after years of revolution, now depended heavily on military success to maintain internal cohesion. Each victory abroad reinforced stability at home. Each failure would have done the opposite. This created a new kind of pressure around Napoleon's role. He was no longer just a commander producing results. He was becoming a stabilizing expectation. And expectations, once formed, do not remain small. They grow until they require either fulfillment or collapse. Inside France, his name began to take on a life of its own. Reports from the Italian front were no longer just military updates. They became political signals, public fascination, and strategic reference points. People spoke of him not only as a successful general, but as someone who seemed to change the conditions of war itself. This perception was dangerous in a system still sensitive to internal power shifts. Because revolutionary governments are always alert to individuals who become larger than their formal position. Napoleon understood this tension without needing it explained. He had always operated with awareness that visibility inside unstable political systems is never neutral. It either becomes control or vulnerability, depending on how it is managed. So he remained careful in how he positioned himself within France's political environment. He did not present himself as a political actor. He presented himself as an executor of necessity. But the distinction was becoming harder for others to maintain, because necessity itself was beginning to revolve around him. Militarily, his campaigns continued to reflect the same underlying logic that had defined his earlier successes: concentration of force, disruption of enemy cohesion, and rapid exploitation of structural weaknesses. But now there was a difference. The scale had expanded. He was no longer shaping isolated outcomes. He was shaping entire regional balances. Armies that once operated independently were now responding to his movements, as if anticipating a single controlling intelligence behind them. Even opponents began to adjust not just to his actions, but to the expectation of his actions. This shift marked something important in warfare. When an opponent begins to predict your presence, your influence extends beyond physical contact. It becomes psychological. And psychological dominance often precedes structural dominance. Within France, political leadership could not ignore this transformation. The revolutionary government relied increasingly on military success to justify its stability, and Napoleon's victories were becoming central to that justification. But with centrality comes dependency, and dependency changes the relationship between power and individual. He was no longer simply being used by the system. The system was beginning to rely on him in a way that reduced its flexibility. This is where rising figures become dangerous to unstable states, not because they oppose the system, but because the system begins to reorganize itself around them. Napoleon's awareness of this dynamic shaped how he continued to operate. He maintained distance from overt political alignment while ensuring continued effectiveness in military roles. He avoided unnecessary entanglement in internal factional struggles, focusing instead on sustaining the momentum that had already been established. But momentum has its own logic. It does not remain confined. It expands. And as his successes accumulated, so did the narrative surrounding him. He was increasingly described not just as a capable general, but as someone whose presence altered the structure of conflict itself. This narrative did not come from him. It formed around him. And once narratives form around individuals in unstable systems, they begin to influence decisions about those individuals. Assignments become larger, expectations become heavier, and risks become more concentrated. Napoleon was now operating within this new reality, where his identity was no longer defined solely by his actions, but also by how others interpreted his growing significance. This is a critical turning point in any rise, because interpretation is no longer fully controllable by the individual. It belongs to the system around them. By the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer simply a successful commander within the Revolutionary Wars. He had become a reference point for military effectiveness itself, a standard against which other operations were increasingly measured. And in systems under pressure, reference points eventually become centers of gravity. They begin to pull decisions toward them. They begin to shape the structure of expectation. And they begin to attract the kind of attention that cannot remain purely military for long. Because when one figure consistently reshapes outcomes at scale, the question inevitably shifts from what they can do to what they might become. And that question changes everything that follows. There is a point in every rising force where success no longer feels like achievement, it feels like maintenance. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that point came not after a defeat, but after a string of victories so consistent that they stopped surprising anyone. The campaigns in Italy had already reshaped how he was seen, but now the transformation was deeper. His success had become the baseline expectation of an entire system. France, still under the pressure of revolutionary instability and external conflict, had entered a condition where military performance was directly tied to political survival. Victories were not just celebrated, they were required to sustain internal confidence in the state itself. And Napoleon had become one of the primary sources of those victories. This created a paradox. The more successful he became, the less exceptional each success appeared in isolation, not because it mattered less, but because the system began to assume it would continue. Expectation removes the feeling of surprise. And without surprise, achievement becomes obligation. Within France, his name was now firmly embedded in both military and political consciousness. He was no longer a distant commander operating on the edge of the state's attention. He had moved into its center of reference. Decisions were increasingly made with his presence in mind. Campaigns were structured with his effectiveness assumed. and strategies were adjusted based on the expectation that he would deliver results under pressure. This is where influence begins to shift shape. Because when a system begins to design itself around an individual's reliability, that individual is no longer just part of the system. They become part of its structure. But structure brings constraint as well as power. Napoleon understood this shift, even if it was not formally acknowledged by those around him. He could feel the difference in how requests were framed, how expectations were expressed, and how his absence or presence altered planning itself. He was no longer simply being assigned tasks. He was being relied upon to stabilize outcomes. At the same time, his success continued to depend on conditions that were becoming increasingly complex. The Revolutionary Wars were not static conflicts. They were expanding, shifting, and adapting in response to both internal political change and external military pressure. Each new campaign carried different constraints, different terrain, different alliances, and different risks. Yet the expectation remained the same: success. Napoleon's method of warfare continued to evolve within this environment. He refined his focus on speed, concentration of force, and disruption of enemy coordination. But more importantly, he developed an increasing sensitivity to timing, understanding not just where to strike, but when a system was most vulnerable to being disrupted. This was not just tactical awareness. It was structural perception. He was no longer simply reading battlefields. He was reading systems in motion. And systems in motion reveal weaknesses only at certain moments. As his campaigns continued, the psychological effect of his presence expanded beyond his own army. Opposing forces increasingly reacted to the anticipation of his movements. Entire strategies began to shift based on the expectation of where he would appear, rather than where he actually was. This created a feedback loop. The more he was anticipated, the more influence he exerted without direct engagement. And the more influence he exerted, the more he became central to the structure of war itself. Within France, this growing influence did not translate into simple stability. Instead, it created a subtle tension between admiration, reliance, and caution. He was too successful to ignore, too effective to limit easily, and too central to remove without consequence. This is where systems begin to experience dependency anxiety. They rely on an individual while simultaneously becoming uncertain about how much reliance is too much. Napoleon existed inside that contradiction. He was both solution and potential imbalance, both asset and risk. But for the moment, success continued to resolve the tension in his favor. Each victory reinforced the necessity of his role. Each campaign expanded the space in which he operated. And each success made the idea of failure more significant than it had been before. Because the higher an individual rises within a system, the more their outcomes define not just their future, but the expectations of the system itself. At this stage, Napoleon was no longer operating as someone climbing a structure. He was operating as someone holding a structure in place through performance. And that is a fundamentally different position. One depends on progression. The other depends on continuation. By the end of this phase, the question surrounding him was no longer whether he was effective. That had already been answered repeatedly. The question was what would happen when effectiveness was no longer enough to define stability. Because systems built on reliance eventually reach a point where they must either expand to contain that reliance or restructure around it entirely. And neither option is neutral. Both reshape the future. Success has a threshold where it stops being personal and starts becoming structural. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that threshold had already been crossed without ceremony. There was no moment of announcement, no clear boundary where achievement turned into expectation. It simply happened through repetition, through victories accumulating until they no longer felt like events, but like conditions the system depended on. France, still shaped by the aftermath of revolution and the pressure of continuous war, had become a state where stability was manufactured through military success. The government no longer relied on calm governance alone. It relied on momentum, on victories that could hold internal tensions together. And Napoleon was at the center of that momentum. But being at the center of momentum is not the same as being secure. It is being exposed to every shift in direction. After his successes in Italy, Napoleon's position had transformed again. He was no longer just a general whose results were impressive. He had become a necessary figure in the broader machinery of French survival. And necessity is a dangerous form of importance, because it removes the option of absence. Within France, his victories were now interpreted through multiple layers at once. Militarily, they were evidence of strategic superiority. Politically, they were symbols of state strength. Publicly, they were sources of pride and fascination. But within leadership circles, they created something more complicated, dependence mixed with caution. The same success that made him invaluable also made him difficult to fully integrate into existing structures of control. He was no longer simply operating under authority, he was shaping outcomes that authority depended on. And that shift is where systems begin to quietly reassess individuals. Not because they have failed, but because they have succeeded too consistently. Napoleon himself was aware of this changing dynamic. He did not interpret his position as stable in the traditional sense. He understood that in environments shaped by revolution and war, stability is temporary and conditional. What matters is not recognition, but continued utility. So he remained focused on maintaining effectiveness rather than consolidating status. But effectiveness at this level is no longer purely tactical. It becomes systemic. Every campaign now carried implications beyond the battlefield. A victory reinforced not only territorial control, but the credibility of the revolutionary state itself. A setback would have had consequences that extended into political legitimacy. This meant that Napoleon's role had expanded beyond military command. He was now indirectly involved in sustaining the internal structure of France through external action. And that kind of role cannot remain purely military for long. It begins to overlap with governance, influence, and perception management, even if the individual does not formally seek those domains. At the same time, his increasing prominence created a subtle shift in how others interacted with him. Orders were no longer given with the same assumption of equal operational uncertainty. Instead, there was an expectation that he would interpret, adjust, and execute in ways that aligned with broader strategic needs, even when details were left open. This gave him room, but also responsibility. Because when instructions become less specific, outcomes become more personally attributed. Napoleon continued to operate within this expanding space with the same underlying logic that had guided him earlier: concentration of force, rapid movement, and structural disruption of enemy coordination. But the scale of application had changed. He was no longer influencing isolated engagements. He was influencing entire theaters of war. And with scale comes visibility. Opposing forces began to treat his movements as central to their own planning. Entire strategies were shaped not only by French strength, but by anticipation of his decisions. This created a psychological dimension to warfare that extended beyond physical confrontation. In practical terms, this meant that his presence altered behavior even before direct contact occurred. And that is one of the clearest signs that influence has moved beyond tactical boundaries. Inside France, this transformation was impossible to ignore. His name was now associated not just with success, but with the idea of French military capability itself. He had become a reference point for what effective command looked like in the Revolutionary Wars. But reference points carry weight in both directions. They elevate expectations, and they narrow acceptable outcomes. Because once a system defines an individual as a standard, any deviation from that standard becomes noticeable. And notice quickly becomes judgment. Napoleon's position, therefore, was no longer simply about achieving victories. It was about maintaining a level of performance that had already been defined as exceptional. This is where success becomes structurally demanding, because it is no longer measured against the average. It is measured against itself, and that standard rises with every repetition. Despite this pressure, his trajectory continued forward, not because the system guaranteed it, but because the conditions he operated in still required his type of effectiveness. France was still unstable, the wars were still ongoing, the need for decisive military action had not diminished. So he remained central. But centrality is not permanence. It is exposure to every change in direction the system might undergo. And by the end of this phase, one truth was becoming increasingly clear within the structure around him. Napoleon was no longer simply being used by the system. He was becoming something the system could not easily operate without. And when that happens, the next question is never about ability. It is about control. There are moments when a system does not announce change. It absorbs it quietly until everything functions differently without admitting it has shifted. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the stage where success no longer expanded his freedom, but began to define its limits. France, still shaped by revolutionary transformation and ongoing war, had become a state held together by pressure rather than stability. Military campaigns were not separate from governance. They were one of the main ways governance survived at all. Victory abroad meant temporary calm at home. Failure meant immediate internal strain. And in that fragile balance, Napoleon had become a central stabilizing force. But stabilizing forces are never treated as permanent solutions. They are treated as necessary conditions that must be managed. After his campaign successes in Italy, Napoleon's role had expanded far beyond what any early-stage officer would normally experience. He was no longer simply executing plans, he was generating outcomes that shaped political confidence inside France itself. This created an unusual situation. He was still formally part of the military hierarchy, but functionally, he was operating at a level where his actions influenced the system's ability to maintain internal equilibrium. That kind of position does not remain purely military for long. Because when military outcomes begin to affect political stability directly, every decision becomes indirectly political, even when the intent is purely strategic. Napoleon understood this tension with increasing clarity. He did not attempt to convert his success into political language. Instead, he maintained a consistent focus on operational effectiveness. His belief remained rooted in structure. If results are delivered consistently, position will follow naturally. But systems under strain do not always reward consistency with stability. Sometimes they reward it with dependence. And dependence changes the nature of trust. Within France, his success had now reached a point where it could no longer be treated as exceptional without also becoming expected. This shift is subtle but important. When success is exceptional, it is praised. When it becomes expected, it is required. And requirement is heavier than praise, because it carries consequence. At the same time, the revolutionary state continued to evolve internally. Political authority remained unstable, with shifting leadership structures responding to both internal pressures and external threats. Military success was still essential, but it was also becoming something that needed to be politically managed. Napoleon existed inside this overlap between military necessity and political sensitivity. And that overlap is where systems begin to reassess individuals not only for what they do, but for what they represent. His growing prominence meant that he was no longer just a commander producing outcomes. He was becoming a symbol of capability within the revolutionary state. And symbols are never neutral. They attract interpretation from every direction. Some saw him as the embodiment of the revolution's strength. Others saw him as a concentration of influence that did not yet have a clearly defined political form. Both interpretations carried implications for how his role would be treated moving forward. Napoleon did not openly engage with these interpretations. He continued to operate through the framework that had carried him so far: efficiency, decisiveness, and structural awareness of conflict. But something was changing beneath that surface. Because as his influence expanded, the space in which he could act freely without consequence began to narrow. Not through direct restriction, but through expectation. Every action now existed within a larger narrative that extended beyond immediate military outcomes. Decisions were no longer evaluated only for tactical effectiveness, but also for what they implied about future potential. This created a new kind of pressure, one that does not come from opposition, but from attention. Within the military structure, his presence increasingly shaped planning assumptions. Operations were designed with the expectation that his involvement would alter outcomes significantly. This did not always mean he was formally in command of everything, but it did mean his role had become difficult to separate from overall strategic success. And once a system begins to assume your effectiveness, your absence becomes more noticeable than your presence. That is a turning point that cannot be reversed easily, because it changes how decisions are made around you. Napoleon was now operating in that space, where his influence was no longer confined to direct action, but extended into how others structured their actions in anticipation of him. At the same time, his awareness of system dynamics continued to deepen. He increasingly recognized that revolutionary environments do not stabilize simply through success. They stabilize through control of perception, alignment of outcomes, and management of internal pressure points. But he did not attempt to control the system externally. He continued to operate within it. And that distinction is important, because operating within a system that is changing around you is not the same as directing that change. It is adaptation under constraint. By the end of this phase, the relationship between Napoleon and the French state had shifted into a more complex form. He was no longer just a military asset, and the state was no longer just an employer of his skills. They had become interdependent in a way that neither side could fully simplify. He needed the system for legitimacy and structure. The system needed him for stability and success. And when two forces become mutually dependent in unstable conditions, the balance between them begins to define the next stage of history. Not through agreement, but through tension. And that tension was now becoming impossible to ignore. There is a stage in rising influence where attention stops flowing in one direction. It begins to return. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the phase where success no longer simply elevated him. It began to surround him, examine him, and slowly redefine what he was allowed to be. France, still living in the aftermath of revolutionary upheaval, had entered a condition where political stability and military necessity were inseparable. The state no longer functioned as a single consistent structure. It operated as a set of overlapping pressures trying to hold each other in balance. In such a system, individuals who consistently produce stability become more than participants. They become structural components. Napoleon had already reached that stage through his campaigns in Italy, where success had transformed into expectation. But now something more subtle was happening. The system that had elevated him was beginning to observe him more closely than before. Not because of failure, but because of scale. When an individual becomes too consistently effective, the question inside unstable systems gradually shifts from how useful are they to how controllable are they. Napoleon was now inside that shift. His actions were still producing the same kind of outcomes that had defined his rise: rapid resolution of conflict, structural disruption of opposing forces, and consistent delivery of results under pressure. But the meaning of those outcomes had changed. They were no longer just achievements. They were indicators. Indicators of capability that could not easily be matched elsewhere in the system. And indicators of capability always attract evaluation from above. Within France, leadership structures were still fragmented by the lingering effects of revolution. Authority existed, but it was not fully stable or centralized in a permanent form. Different institutions and figures held influence in overlapping ways, and that meant no single interpretation of Napoleon's rise was universally accepted. To some, he was a necessary instrument of survival. To others, he was a concentration of influence that had not yet been formally bounded. Both interpretations carried consequences. Because in unstable political environments, ambiguity is never left unresolved for long. It is either clarified through integration or managed through restriction. Napoleon, for his part, continued to operate within the same internal logic that had guided him from the beginning. He focused on effectiveness, timing, and structural disruption of enemy coordination. But increasingly, he also had to account for something he had not previously needed to manage at this scale: perception beyond the battlefield. His victories were no longer confined to military reports. They were interpreted politically, discussed publicly, and used as reference points in discussions about the strength and direction of the revolutionary state. This meant that every campaign carried dual consequences: one in war, one in narrative. And narrative has its own momentum. Inside the military, his presence continued to reshape expectations. Plans increasingly assumed his involvement as a factor that would alter outcomes significantly. This was not formalized authority in the traditional sense, but it functioned similarly in practice. He was becoming embedded in decision-making structures without always being explicitly placed at their center. This is where influence becomes difficult to separate from control. Because once decisions are made in anticipation of your actions, your presence begins to shape outcomes even when you are not directly acting. At the same time, Napoleon himself was becoming more aware of the limitations that came with this level of visibility. He understood that in systems undergoing internal instability, prominence is never purely beneficial. It always carries a parallel risk: the risk of becoming too central to be left unexamined. So he continued to maintain a careful balance. He remained operationally decisive, but politically restrained in expression. He avoided unnecessary alignment with shifting internal factions while ensuring that his effectiveness in military roles remained unquestionable. This was not detachment. It was controlled positioning. But even controlled positioning cannot fully prevent interpretation. As his influence expanded, so did the number of perspectives trying to define what he represented. Within the revolutionary state, he was increasingly seen not just as a general, but as a figure whose capabilities could influence the broader trajectory of France itself. This is where systems begin to develop a dual relationship with rising figures. They rely on them and simultaneously reassess them. Dependence creates stability in the short term, but uncertainty in the long term. Because the more a system depends on a single point of effectiveness, the more it must consider what happens if that point shifts, resists, or simply becomes too independent to manage easily. Napoleon was now positioned at the center of that contradiction. And contradictions inside unstable systems rarely remain unresolved. They escalate, not necessarily through conflict, but through increasing pressure to define boundaries. By the end of this stage, the transformation was no longer just about Napoleon's rise. It was about the system around him adjusting to his presence. And when a system begins adjusting itself around an individual, the next phase is no longer about growth alone. It becomes about direction. Because once influence reaches structural importance, it no longer simply expands outward. It begins to turn inward, toward control, containment, or consolidation. And that shift changes everything that comes next. Power becomes unstable the moment it stops being clearly distributed. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this stage was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a gradual tightening of the space around him, where success still continued, but the system surrounding that success began to shift its posture. France, still shaped by revolutionary turbulence and ongoing war, had reached a point where governance and military necessity were almost indistinguishable. Political authority did not exist in a stable form. It existed as a series of competing structures trying to maintain control over a country that had already been fundamentally transformed. In that environment, military success was not just important. It was stabilizing. And Napoleon had become one of its most reliable sources. But reliability at scale creates a paradox. The more dependable an individual becomes, the more the system begins to evaluate what that dependence costs. After his continued successes in Italy, Napoleon was no longer operating at the margins of state interest. He was embedded within its strategic expectations. Campaign planning, resource allocation, and even political confidence increasingly adjusted themselves around the assumption that his presence would produce results. This was no longer simple command. It was structural reliance. And structural reliance is never comfortable for systems that are still uncertain about their own stability. Inside France, this created a dual perception of him. On one side, he was seen as the most effective military mind of the Revolutionary Wars, someone capable of turning unstable fronts into decisive outcomes. On the other side, he was becoming a figure whose concentration of effectiveness was difficult to categorize within traditional institutional boundaries. Neither perception was openly hostile, but both were attentive. And attention, at this level, begins to function as a form of containment. Napoleon continued to operate with the same underlying logic that had defined his rise: focus on decisive points, disrupt enemy cohesion, and move faster than the system opposing him could stabilize. Yet now there was an added layer to every decision. He was not only shaping battlefield outcomes, he was shaping expectations about himself. And expectations are difficult to control once they become widespread. Within the military structure, his influence had reached a point where it subtly altered planning assumptions even when he was not directly involved. Campaigns were designed with his capabilities in mind. Command structures were adjusted to account for his potential involvement. Strategic discussions increasingly treated his effectiveness as a constant factor rather than a variable. This is where influence begins to move beyond role and into structure. Because when a system begins to assume your effectiveness, it starts reorganizing itself around you. And once that happens, your position is no longer defined solely by your actions. It is defined by the system's dependence on those actions. Napoleon was aware of this shift, even if it was never formally acknowledged. He understood that in revolutionary environments, the line between usefulness and perceived concentration of power is thin. Too little effectiveness and relevance fades. Too much, and attention becomes focused on control. So he continued to maintain operational focus while avoiding unnecessary entanglement in internal political dynamics. But avoidance does not eliminate perception. It only limits direct engagement. And perception in unstable systems evolves independently. At the same time, his campaigns continued to reinforce the idea that he was operating on a different level of structural understanding. He consistently demonstrated an ability to see conflict not as isolated engagements, but as interconnected systems of movement and pressure. This allowed him to act in ways that produced cascading effects rather than incremental ones. The result was a growing sense that his presence changed the conditions of warfare itself. Not just outcomes, conditions. This distinction matters because outcomes can be repeated. Conditions redefine what outcomes are possible. Inside France, this growing influence began to produce a subtle shift in how he was positioned within broader strategic thinking. He was no longer simply a commander to be assigned to critical fronts. He was becoming a factor that defined what counted as a critical front. And when an individual begins to influence what is considered strategically important, they are no longer just part of decision-making. They begin to shape it. But with that shift comes a corresponding increase in sensitivity around their role. Because systems that depend on concentrated effectiveness also become cautious about how that concentration develops. Napoleon existed within that tension. He was central enough to matter deeply, but not yet positioned in a way that fully resolved how that centrality would be managed long-term. This is the edge of control, where influence is no longer purely upward and oversight is no longer purely external. It becomes mutual awareness. And mutual awareness inside unstable systems rarely remains static. It evolves toward either integration or restriction. At the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer simply a successful general operating within a revolutionary army. He had become a structural presence within the system itself, one whose actions no longer just affected outcomes, but increasingly shaped the framework within which outcomes were defined. And once that level is reached, the next stage is no longer about expansion. It is about what the system decides to do with the influence it can no longer ignore. There is a subtle shift that happens in unstable states. They stop distributing responsibility evenly and begin concentrating it wherever results appear most reliable. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this shift was no longer a background pattern. It was becoming the structure of his reality. France, still shaped by the aftershocks of revolution and continuous warfare, had reached a stage where governance and survival were deeply intertwined. Military success was not just an extension of policy, it was one of the main ways policy could still function at all. And Napoleon had become one of its most consistent sources. But consistency at that level does something to a system. It reduces hesitation. Not in the individual, but in the system around them. After his sustained successes in Italy, Napoleon was no longer treated as an optional asset to be deployed selectively. He was increasingly treated as a necessary component in situations where failure was not acceptable. This is where reliance begins to form. Quietly, without formal declaration. Not through a single appointment, but through repeated decisions that gradually remove alternatives. He was still technically operating within the military hierarchy, but the way he was used no longer reflected equal substitution. When uncertainty increased, he was more likely to be chosen. When outcomes mattered more, he was more likely to be assigned. Over time, this creates a pattern that becomes difficult to reverse. Because systems under pressure prioritize what has already worked. And Napoleon had worked repeatedly. Within France, this growing reliance did not appear as a single political decision. It emerged through accumulation, reports of victories, stabilization of fronts, and consistent delivery of results in conditions where others struggled. As a result, his presence began to influence planning at a deeper level than before. Not just execution, but design. Campaigns were increasingly structured with the expectation that his involvement would shift outcomes significantly. This meant that even before he acted, his potential presence was already shaping strategic decisions. And when anticipation begins to influence planning, influence has already moved beyond action. It has entered structure. Napoleon himself continued to operate within the same internal logic that had guided his rise: focus on decisive points, disrupt cohesion, and maintain momentum. But now, he was doing so inside a system that was beginning to organize itself around those very methods. This created an unusual dynamic. He was still operating within the system, but the system was also adapting itself to him. And adaptation in unstable environments is never neutral. It always implies recognition of necessity. At the same time, his role continued to expand in scope. He was no longer confined to localized operational decisions. His actions increasingly had regional and strategic implications, influencing how entire theaters of war were approached. This expansion did not necessarily come with formal elevation at every stage. Instead, it came through functional necessity. When outcomes depended on his involvement became more frequent. And frequency becomes structure over time. Inside France, this began to produce a quiet but important realization among those observing the war effort. Certain outcomes were becoming difficult to imagine without him. That is a critical point in any system. When imagination itself begins to depend on an individual's presence. Because once that happens, absence is no longer neutral. It becomes disruptive. Napoleon was now entering that space, where his role was not only defined by what he did, but by what others could no longer easily conceive being done without him. This is where dependence becomes psychological as well as operational. And psychological dependence is often more powerful than formal authority. At the same time, Napoleon remained aware that this kind of position is inherently unstable. Revolutionary systems do not maintain fixed centers of power for long. They shift, recalibrate, and reassess continuously based on internal pressures and external threats. So he continued to maintain a careful balance between visibility and function. He did not present himself as a political figure. He did not seek to redefine the system overtly. He continued to operate as a military executor of necessity. But necessity itself was now increasingly associated with him. And that association cannot be easily contained once it becomes widespread. As campaigns continued, his methods of warfare became even more closely associated with structural disruption of enemy forces rather than simple battlefield advantage. He consistently aimed to break coordination, isolate strength, and create conditions where opponents could no longer operate as unified systems. This approach continued to produce results. But more importantly, it began to define expectations about what effective war looked like in the revolutionary context. And once a method becomes expectation, it stops being personal. It becomes institutional. By the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer simply operating as a highly effective general within a revolutionary army. He was functioning as a central point around which both strategy and expectation were increasingly organized. And when a system begins to organize itself around a single point of reliability, it inevitably reaches a question it cannot avoid for long. What happens when that point moves, or refuses to move at all, or begins to define its own direction? That question was no longer theoretical. It was becoming the next stage of reality. There is a moment in every ascent where control is no longer about issuing decisions, but about shaping the environment in which decisions are even possible. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that moment arrived as his reputation stopped being tied to individual campaigns and started being embedded in the logic of French military planning itself. France, still driven by revolutionary transformation and constant external pressure, had become a state that could not separate war from governance. The military was no longer just defending territory, it was actively sustaining the political existence of the state. And Napoleon had become one of its most effective instruments. But instruments, when used repeatedly in critical systems, begin to change the hand that uses them. After his campaigns in Italy, Napoleon's influence no longer depended solely on his direct presence on the battlefield. His methods, reputation, and expected effectiveness began to shape decisions before he was even assigned to them. This created a widening gap between command and control. He could still be ordered, but increasingly, the structure of those orders assumed his effectiveness as a constant. And when assumptions become embedded in planning, they begin to function like invisible authority. Within France, this shift was not formally recognized as a transfer of power. There was no declaration, no structural reform, no official redefinition of his position. Instead, it emerged through behavior. Commanders planned differently when his name was attached to an operation. Resources were allocated with different expectations. Strategic priorities shifted based on the likelihood of his involvement. This is how control begins to migrate without announcement. Not through takeover, but through dependence. Napoleon himself continued to operate within the framework of military necessity. He did not attempt to convert his influence into overt political authority. Instead, he maintained focus on operational effectiveness, ensuring that each assignment reinforced the perception that he was the most reliable solution to instability. But reliability at this level is no longer just personal competence. It becomes structural expectation. And structural expectation reshapes systems more deeply than formal rank. As his role expanded, he became increasingly associated with outcomes that were no longer considered uncertain when he was involved. This altered the psychological landscape of military planning. Opponents began to prepare not only for French forces, but for the anticipated presence of his strategic logic. This anticipation itself became part of the battlefield. Because warfare is not only physical confrontation, it is also the management of expectation. And Napoleon's presence increasingly distorted that expectation in France's favor. Inside the revolutionary state, this created a subtle but growing imbalance. He was still formally part of the military hierarchy, but the effectiveness attributed to him exceeded the normal boundaries of that structure. This is where systems begin to experience tension between form and function. Form says he is one officer among many. Function says outcomes depend disproportionately on him. And when form and function diverge too far, systems begin to adjust, slowly, cautiously, and often without explicit acknowledgement. Napoleon existed inside that divergence. He was not yet separate from the system, but he was no longer fully contained by it either. At the same time, his continued success reinforced a pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Wherever he was placed, instability tended to collapse into structure more quickly than elsewhere. This was not just tactical advantage, it was systemic impact. And systemic impact is what moves individuals from operational roles into structural significance. As this perception spread, his presence began to influence not only military outcomes, but the way military problems were defined in the first place. Regions in crisis were increasingly evaluated through the lens of whether his involvement could resolve them. Situations that might previously have been considered prolonged conflicts were reframed as problems requiring concentrated intervention. This shift is subtle but profound, because it changes not just solutions, but problem definition itself. And whoever influences problem definition begins to influence the entire system that responds to it. Napoleon's awareness of this dynamic remained implicit rather than explicit. He did not frame his position in theoretical terms. He continued to operate through action, timing, and structural understanding of conflict, but the environment around him was increasingly shaped by his repeated effectiveness. This created a feedback loop. Success created reliance. Reliance created expectation. Expectation created structural integration. And structural integration created further success. By the end of this phase, Napoleon was no longer simply operating within the French military system. He was becoming part of how the system defined effectiveness itself. Not yet above it, not yet outside it, but deeply embedded within its logic. And when an individual becomes embedded in the logic of a system, the next transformation is no longer about what they can do. It is about what the system will become in response to them. And that is where true historical movement begins to accelerate. At a certain point in a rising trajectory, an individual is no longer just responding to events. Events begin to arrange themselves around that individual. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the stage where his presence stopped being an assignment and started becoming a condition for how decisions were made. France, still operating under the unstable weight of revolutionary transformation and continuous warfare, had become a system that survived through responsiveness rather than permanence. Authority shifted, institutions adapted, and military necessity dictated political survival in ways that traditional states had never experienced at the same scale. In that environment, Napoleon had moved beyond being simply an effective commander. He had become a reference point around which effectiveness itself was measured. After his successes in Italy, his influence was no longer confined to the outcomes of battles he personally commanded. It had begun to extend into the way problems were interpreted before any action was taken. This is the moment where systems begin to reorganize themselves silently, not through formal restructuring, but through repeated behavioral adjustments. Military planners began to evaluate crises differently depending on whether his involvement was likely. Regions under pressure were assessed not only in terms of enemy strength or logistics, but in terms of whether his deployment would likely resolve instability faster than conventional methods. That single shift changes everything. Because once a system starts evaluating problems through the lens of one individual's effectiveness, that individual becomes embedded in the system's decision-making logic. Napoleon was now operating inside that logic, but he was also reshaping it. He continued to approach warfare through the same structural principles that had defined his rise: concentration of force, disruption of coordination, and exploitation of timing. Yet at this stage, those methods were no longer just personal strategies. They were becoming expectations of how success itself should be achieved. And when methods become expectations, they begin to influence everyone operating within the same system, not just the individual who created them. This created a subtle but powerful transformation in the French military environment. The idea of what was possible in warfare began to shift. Operations that would previously have been considered too risky or too rapid began to appear viable when framed through his demonstrated effectiveness. In this way, Napoleon was not only winning wars, He was expanding the perceived boundaries of war itself. Inside France, this growing centrality created a new kind of dependency. His name was increasingly associated with stabilization under pressure. When uncertainty rose, his involvement became the implied solution. This is where structural reliance becomes self-reinforcing. Because the more a system depends on a particular form of success, the more it adapts itself to require that form of success again. Napoleon's position was now defined less by formal command structure and more by functional necessity. He was still within the military hierarchy, but his role increasingly transcended the usual limitations of rank. Orders, in many cases, assumed his interpretive authority. Strategic flexibility was granted because his past decisions had proven effective under similar conditions. Even when directives were issued from higher structures, they were shaped by the assumption that his execution would define their success. This created a layered form of influence. Direct authority remained elsewhere, but operational reality increasingly aligned around him. At the same time, Napoleon himself continued to operate with a consistent internal logic. Avoid unnecessary political entanglement, maintain focus on operational outcomes, and preserve mobility within the system rather than attempting to dominate it directly. But systems under pressure do not remain neutral towards such individuals. They begin to adapt around them regardless of intent. As his influence expanded, so did the number of interpretations attached to it. Some viewed him as the most reliable instrument of the revolutionary state's survival. Others viewed him as a concentration of capability that did not yet have a clear structural limit. Both interpretations had the same underlying consequence: attention. And attention at this scale is never passive. It always leads to adjustment. By this stage, Napoleon's presence was no longer simply part of the French military system. It had become part of how the system defined itself under stress. He was not outside it, but he was also no longer fully contained by it. This is the edge where systems begin to lose clear separation between individual and structure, where the success of one becomes indistinguishable from the stability of the whole. And once that boundary dissolves, the next phase is no longer about expansion or recognition. It is about redefinition. Because a system that begins to revolve around a single point of effectiveness cannot remain unchanged for long. It must either integrate the point fully into its structure or reshape itself in response to it. And neither outcome is small. Both change the nature of power itself. There is a stage in every rising system where success stops being celebrated and starts being studied. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the moment where his achievements no longer simply strengthened France. They began to change how France understood control itself. The state, still shaped by revolutionary upheaval and continuous war, had reached a condition where survival depended on speed, adaptability, and decisive force. Traditional structures of governance were still present, but they were constantly being reshaped by the demands of conflict. In that environment, stability was not a fixed state. It was a temporary achievement maintained through pressure. Napoleon had become one of the most reliable sources of that pressure turning into order. After his campaigns in Italy, his influence had expanded far beyond battlefield outcomes. He was no longer simply associated with victories. He was associated with the conditions that made victory possible. This is a critical distinction, because winning battles is one form of capability. But shaping the conditions under which battles are won is something deeper. It moves from execution into structure. Inside France, this shift did not produce immediate alarm. Instead, it produced something more subtle: adjustment. Military and political decision-making gradually began to incorporate his presence as a factor in planning, even when he was not directly involved. Regions under threat were evaluated through a new lens, whether his intervention could resolve instability faster than traditional methods. Campaigns were designed with the expectation that his involvement would reshape outcomes significantly. And slowly, without formal declaration, he became part of the system's internal logic. Not as an exception, but as a reference point. This is where systems begin to change shape without acknowledging that they are changing. Because once a system starts using one individual as a benchmark for effectiveness, it begins to reorganize its expectations around that individual's capabilities. Napoleon was now operating inside that reorganization, but he was also contributing to it. His methods of warfare, rapid concentration of force, disruption of enemy coordination, and exploitation of timing were no longer just personal strategies. They were becoming increasingly recognized as the most effective response to the conditions France faced. And when methods become widely recognized as effective, they begin to influence institutional thinking beyond the individual who uses them. This created a feedback loop that strengthened his position further. Success reinforced reliance. Reliance reinforced expectation. And expectation reinforced structural integration. At this stage, Napoleon was still formally within the military hierarchy, but functionally, his influence extended beyond the typical boundaries of command. Decisions were increasingly shaped with his anticipated involvement in mind, even before he acted. This is where influence stops being visible in simple terms, because it no longer depends on direct action. It depends on anticipation. And anticipation is distributed across the system. Within France, this created a growing awareness, though not always explicitly stated, that certain outcomes had become significantly more likely when tied to his presence. This did not immediately translate into political consolidation, but it did alter how authority was exercised in practice. He was not yet the center of power, but he was becoming a point around which power adjusted itself. And that is a fundamentally different condition from traditional command. Because traditional command operates through assignment. Structural influence operates through necessity. Napoleon continued to maintain his operational focus, avoiding unnecessary political entanglement and continuing to emphasize effectiveness in military execution. But systems under pressure do not remain passive towards such figures. They respond, sometimes by relying more heavily, sometimes by attempting to define boundaries more clearly, and sometimes by preparing for what happens when reliance becomes too concentrated. By this phase, Napoleon's position had become paradoxical. He was simultaneously indispensable and increasingly difficult to categorize within existing structures of authority. His effectiveness made him essential, but his centrality made him a subject of ongoing evaluation within the system. And evaluation at that level is never neutral. It always implies potential adjustment. The deeper truth emerging beneath all of this was simple but powerful. France was no longer just using Napoleon as a tool of military success. It was beginning to structure parts of its decision-making process around his continued effectiveness. And once a system begins to do that, it crosses a threshold it cannot easily reverse. Because dependence at that scale does not remain stable. It evolves toward either integration into formal structure or consolidation into something new entirely. And neither path leaves the system unchanged. At the end of this stage, Napoleon was no longer simply a figure rising through military success. He had become a structural necessity within a state still trying to define its own shape. And when an individual becomes a necessity rather than an option, The next phase is no longer about influence. It is about what form that necessity will eventually take. Because systems do not remain indefinitely dependent without resolution. They either absorb the dependency or they transform it into control. At the end of every long ascent, there is a stage where continuation is no longer about progress, it is about inevitability. For Napoleon Bonaparte, this was the point where his rise stopped feeling like a sequence of successes and started resembling a structural reality that the system around him could no longer easily step outside of. France, still shaped by revolutionary instability and the constant demands of war, had become a state where survival depended on concentrated effectiveness. The revolution had not produced long-term calm. It had produced a condition in which authority was repeatedly reconstructed in response to pressure. In that environment, consistency was rare, and Napoleon had become one of its most consistent forces. After his campaigns in Italy, his role had already shifted beyond traditional military boundaries. He was no longer simply an officer achieving results. He had become a reference point for what results meant under revolutionary conditions. But reference points do something important to systems. They reshape decision-making even when they are not directly involved. By this stage, French military and political structures were no longer evaluating crises in a neutral way. They were increasingly interpreting them through a framework that assumed Napoleon's effectiveness as part of the solution space. This is the final stage of structural embedding. Not formal authority, not declared leadership, but implicit necessity. When a system begins to define its problems in relation to one individual's capabilities, that individual is no longer operating inside the system in the traditional sense. They are operating inside the system's logic. And logic is harder to change than hierarchy. Napoleon himself continued to act with the same disciplined focus that had defined his earlier career. Rapid decision-making, concentration of force, disruption of enemy coordination, and exploitation of timing to create disproportionate outcomes. But at this point, his actions were no longer the only factor shaping his influence. The system's interpretation of his actions had become equally important. Each success reinforced the assumption that his presence altered the outcome space itself. Each campaign added weight to the idea that instability could be resolved more effectively through his involvement than through conventional distribution of command. And once that assumption becomes embedded, it begins to guide future decisions automatically. Inside France, this created a quiet but powerful transformation. Strategic thinking increasingly revolved around the expectation that certain crises required concentrated resolution rather than distributed management. This did not eliminate other commanders, but it changed how their roles were positioned in relation to him. He was becoming the point of convergence, not through declaration, but through repeated necessity. At the same time, this level of centrality introduced a different kind of tension into the system. Because when one figure becomes repeatedly associated with resolution, the system begins to depend on that association continuing without interruption. And dependency at that scale always raises an unspoken question. What happens if it stops, or shifts, or begins to act independently of expectation? Napoleon existed inside that question without needing it verbalized. He remained focused on operational effectiveness, but he was now functioning in a space where effectiveness itself had become inseparable from perception, expectation, and systemic reliance. This is where control becomes distributed across the entire structure rather than held in one place. No single decision defines it anymore. It emerges from accumulated behavior across the system. And that accumulation had reached a point where Napoleon was no longer just influencing outcomes. He was shaping the framework within which outcomes were imagined. This is the final transformation before a system either redefines itself or redefines the individual at its center. Because once an individual becomes embedded in the logic of necessity, they cannot simply be treated as one actor among many. They become a reference point for the system's own survival strategy. And survival strategies are not easily replaced. They are either reinforced or formalized. At the end of this phase, Napoleon's rise had reached its completed structural form within the revolutionary context. He was no longer peripheral, no longer exceptional, and no longer simply influential. He had become integrated into the operating assumptions of a state still struggling to stabilize itself. And when a system integrates an individual into its assumptions of survival, that individual stops being just a participant in history. They become one of the conditions under which history continues to function. And from that point onward, nothing remains the same again.